You were never meant to hear this. Not this story. Not this truth. Because there are certain chapters in history that were buried. Literally buried beneath the soil so that you would never feel the weight of what humanity is capable of when law, morality, and mercy dissolve into nothing. And tonight, I'm going to open that grave for you. Imagine this: a farmer ploughing a quiet field in the spring of 1829. His horse stumbles its hoof, doesn't strike earth, but something hollow. A wooden chest, hidden just beneath the soil. The farmer pries it open, and what he sees inside is not treasure, not tools, not supplies. It is bone, yellowed, fractured, silent bone. A man's skull with the unmistakable signature of violence carved into it. That was the first body, the first secret unearthed. The beginning of the end for a woman who, for nearly 2 decades, ruled terror along the borderland of Delaware and Maryland. Her name was Paddy Cannon. But she was not simply a woman. She was not simply a killer. She was an empire, standing on a foundation of human chains and shallow graves. They called her farm the Reverse Underground Railroad. But understand this: what you're about to hear is not just crime. It's not just murder. This is an institution of evil, a system of abduction and silence, a machine built on the disappearance of the powerless, and it operated in plain sight of a society that chose to look away. And if you think this story belongs to the past, you are mistaken, because the mechanism that allowed Paddy Cannon to thrive is still alive. It is the same mechanism that allows governments, corporations, and institutions to prey upon you today. Unseen.you live in a world designed on the same principles: confusion of jurisdiction, manipulation of law, institutional indifference, and the erasure of inconvenient lives. Paddy Cannon's story is not history, it is blueprint. Let me ask you, why do you think men are so fascinated by stories like this? Why do you find yourself drawn, against your will, to darkness? It is because in darkness, the truth does not wear a mask. The mask is stripped away, and in the reflection of these horrors, you see not only what they did, but what you could become if you allowed yourself to walk untethered by morality. Paddy Cannon was described as a giant of a woman 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that could silence a room. But it wasn't her size that made her powerful. It was her ability to manipulate fear. She understood something fundamental. The weak can be crushed, but the hesitant, the men who suspect, the neighbors who whisper, can be silenced even more effectively with complicity. And complicity, in 1829, was everywhere. Now, let's step back. The borderland between Delaware and Maryland, a swampy intersection of counties where law evaporated, a place so desolate, so fractured, that it became a perfect crucible for an empire. Of crime, roads were little more than muddy cart paths. The forest was endless, broken only by marsh and river. Lawmen hesitated to cross county lines, and those who did often had more allegiance to coin than to justice. And it was here that Paddy Cannon built her murder farm, a place that looked, from the outside, like an ordinary homestead, a simple farmhouse, crops, a barn. Nothing remarkable, until you opened the wrong door, until you descended the wrong set of stairs, until you heard the muffled cries from behind walls that weren't supposed to exist. The Cannon house contained hidden rooms, secret compartments, and concealed spaces where human beings were held against their will. Men, women, and children. Free African Americans who were tricked, trapped, beaten, bound, and sold back into slavery. Families who thought their children had gone to find work only to discover they had vanished forever. And here's the part you're not supposed to think about. Society let it happen. They let it happen because the victims did not matter to them, because they were poor, because they were black, because they were invisible. And this is the first truth you need to learn if you're going to descend with me all the way down into this forbidden story. Evil does not thrive because it is strong. Evil thrives because people choose to look away. Paddy Cannon was indicted on 4 murders. 4, but witnesses whispered of more than 20. The soil itself whispered more. Bones, shallow graves, children. And even then, the system hesitated to punish her. Because to punish her would mean admitting how many people had looked the other way. You see, Patty was not an outlier. She was a reflection of a system that was already corrupted. The ban on importing enslaved Africans in 1808 had created a black market. The South was desperate for labor, and desperate men and women willing to traffic in human beings found their opportunity. Patty's reverse Underground Railroad was not a lone atrocity, was one branch of a larger machine, fueled by greed and protected by silence. But still, one question remains. One question that I want you to keep burning in your mind. As we continue down this path, how does an ordinary woman become this? How does a farmer's wife, a mother, transform into the mistress of a murder farm? The answer is darker than you think. It begins with power, with the realization that in a lawless space, power is not granted, it is taken. And once you taste it, once you understand that you can bend human lives to your will, there is no turning back. And it begins with opportunity. A borderland with fractured authority. Victims who could not defend themselves in court. A society that valued crops more than children. This was not coincidence. It was design. Tonight, you and I are going to dissect that design. We are going to take Paddy Cannon's farm piece by piece, and we are going to reveal not just the horror, but the hidden system beneath it. Because in learning how she built her empire, you will learn how empires of control are still built today, and by the time we reach the end, you will not only know who Paddy Cannon was, you will see her shadow in the world around you, in the institutions that claim to protect you, in the corporations that strip you of your freedom, in the governments that thrive on silence. This is section 1. The grave has been opened. The bones have been seen. Now we descend. You have seen the grave opened. You have seen the bones that broke the silence of a century. But bones are only echoes. To understand Paddy Cannon's empire of blood, you must walk into her world as it truly was, live, breathing, whispering, with fear. The year is 1810. America is still young, a fractured experiment that calls itself a republic. The wounds of revolution have not yet scarred over, and already another darkness has taken root. Cotton has become the lifeblood of the South. The gin has turned fields into gold mines, and every stalk of cotton requires hands that are not paid, hands that are bound. And when the government shuts off the flow of slaves from Africa, a new hunger emerges. Do you see the opening here? Do you see the crack in the system? Where there is demand, there will always be supply. And where there is weakness, predators will gather. The borderland of Delaware and Maryland was the perfect crucible. Think of it, a crossroads where 3 counties touched, each with their own feeble sheriffs, their own corrupt courts, their own sluggish lines of authority. If one lawman pursued you, all you had to do was step across the line. 100 yards could erase the crime. Do you understand now why Paddy Cannon chose this place? It was not random. it was calculated. The land itself was complicit. Marshland swallowed tracks. Forest muffled screams. Rivers carried captives downstream like whispers. A man could vanish, a family could vanish, and the soil would hold its tongue. Into this geography of silence stepped Patty Cannon. She did not begin as the tyrant you imagine. No one does. Evil creeps, it unfolds in increments, and only those who have the eyes to see its pattern recognize its full shape before it is too late. Patty was married young to Jesse Cannon, a quiet farmer. The records paint him as ordinary corn, tobacco, chores, the mundane rhythm of survival. But Patty was not built for ordinary. She was a predator disguised as a wife, and predators do not thrive in stillness. They need motion, they need opportunity, they need blood in the water. Her transformation began with proximity. Her daughters married men who were not simply farmers or blacksmiths. They were kidnappers, slave catchers who made their living by trickery and chains. They roamed the countryside, offering false promises of work, luring the desperate into wagons from which they would never return. And Patty learned. She watched. She adapted. You must understand this. Patty was not a passive participant. She was not dragged into this world by her husbands. She saw the trade. She saw the gold in the shadows. And she sharpened herself against it until she was harder than any man she worked with. Neighbors began to whisper about her size, her voice, her temper. Imagine a 6-foot woman in an era when most men barely scraped 5.5. Imagine her strength, her presence, her ability to command silence with a stare. She knew her advantage. She weaponized it. And when Jesse Cannon died under mysterious circumstances that many suspected were her doing, she stepped fully into her role as matriarch of the murder farm. This is the point I need you to see. Patty Cannon was not only a criminal, she was an institution. She understood hierarchy. She built networks. She controlled men through fear and loyalty. She created something far larger than herself. And that is why she endured for nearly 2 decades. Think of her operation like a web. At the center sat Patty, watching, calculating. Around her spun her daughters, their husbands, and a network of criminal associates. On the outer edges, informants, tavern keepers, wagon drivers, ordinary men willing to trade silence for silver. And caught within the strands of that web were the victims. Free black men and women, children too, snatched from roads, farms, and even their own homes, swallowed into darkness, and then shipped south as property. But here is the most disturbing part. Patty Cannon's cruelty did not stop with kidnapping. She was not satisfied with profit alone. She killed rivals. She killed witnesses. She killed children who might cry too loudly or remember too much. Her land became a graveyard because she understood a principle as old as empire. Fear is strongest when it is final. I want you to pause here and ask yourself something dangerous. What kind of society allows this? What kind of community lives next to a farm that reeks of chains and silence and does nothing? The answer is simple. A society that is already broken. A society where law is a facade, and morality is a costume worn only in daylight. The people who lived near Patty Cannon were not blind. They were not deaf. They chose silence because silence was safe. And safety, in their world, was survival. Now, I'm going to tell you something that you may not want to hear. You live in that same society. Different masks, different tools, but the same silence. How many things have you seen, have you felt in your gut were wrong, but you swallowed your voice? How many times have you looked away because to speak meant to risk your own comfort? Do not judge those neighbors until you judge yourself. The principle has not changed, only the players. By 1815, Paddy's network was thriving. Her farm was not just a home, it was a hub. Victims were held in hidden rooms, in cellars, in outbuildings designed for livestock but repurposed for human cargo. Nights were filled with muffled cries, mornings with wagons slipping out under cover of mist. Some victims never left the farm. Their bones were left behind, feeding the soil, swallowed by silence until the farmer's plow unearthed them years later. Let me tell you something important now, because if you miss this, you will miss the entire pattern of history. Institutions of power survive not because they are invisible, but because they are ignored. Paddy Cannon did not hide her wealth. She did not conceal her violence as carefully as you might think, but she operated in a blind spot society created willingly. They knew and they allowed. This is how corruption works. It doesn't need everyone's participation. It only needs most people's silence. And you must decide, right now, what side of that equation you stand on. Because as you descend deeper into this story, you are no longer just a listener. You are a witness, and witnesses carry a burden. Paddy Cannon's reign continued for years, stretching across states, across counties, across the fragile skin of law itself. She became legend in whispers. Parents warned children not to wander, lest Paddy get you. Free black communities lived in constant terror, never sure if opportunity was genuine or if it was bait for chains, and still she thrived. Still she profited. Still she killed. Now, let me take you into the house itself. Imagine walking across the threshold. The air is heavy, the kind of heavy that clings to your skin. Wooden walls close you in, plain, ordinary to an unsuspecting visitor. But if you pressed the right panel, if you found the right trapdoor, another world opened beneath you. Darkness, chains, eyes staring back at you in silence, waiting, begging, knowing the sun they last saw may be the last sun they will ever see. This was not a home, it was a machine. Every beam of wood, every hidden space, every wagon wheel was part of a larger design, and Paddy stood at the center, conducting it with the cold precision of someone who believed herself untouchable. And why wouldn't she believe that? For years, she was untouchable. Law hesitated, courts faltered, witnesses disappeared, and she grew stronger with every silence. But remember this, no empire of blood lasts forever, and the soil always remembers. We will return to that soil. But first, you must understand the psychology, because Paddy Cannon is not just a woman in history. She is an archetype, the matriarch of control, the embodiment of what happens when power is unchecked and silence is the law of the land. And if you think she is gone, you are wrong. The form changes, the method adapts, but the archetype remains. It walks through your institutions. It governs your corporations. It sells you illusions while it drains your freedom. You live among Paddy Cannons now. You just don't recognize their faces. This is the descent, and it has only just begun. You've seen the beginning. You've felt the soil split open, releasing bones that spoke louder than any witness could. But bones only tell you what happened. They do not tell you how. And if you are to understand Paddy Cannon, not just as a name in history, but as a force, you must study the transformation, because ordinary people do not build empires of blood by accident. They become something else. And if you fail to see how that becoming works, you will fail to recognize it when it appears in your world. Jesse Cannon's death was the catalyst. The quiet farmer was gone, and Patty stood alone with land, a family, and the hunger that had been growing inside her. Some said she poisoned him. Some said he wasted away, consumed by the shadow of the woman he had married. The truth is lost. What matters is that his death unshackled her. The farm was hers. The crossroads were hers. And silence was hers to command. Most women of that era would have withered under widowhood. But Patty was not most women. She was a predator who had just shed the last restraint on her appetite. Here's the first truth. I want you to burn into your mind. Predators are not born whole. They assemble themselves piece by piece. They study. They adapt. They sharpen. Patty's apprenticeship came through the men her daughters married. Slave catchers, kidnappers, men who knew how to turn deception into coin. They knew the price of a strong back in the cotton fields. They knew the routes, the traders, the buyers who asked no questions. They knew how to lure, how to bind, how to transport. And Patty learned every detail. But she went further than her sons-in-law. They were blunt instruments. She was strategy. She was patience. She was organization. She understood that an operation built only on muscle would collapse. It needed layers. It needed compartments. It needed a system that could endure even when one part was exposed. And so she built it. At the center was the farm. A simple house on the surface, but beneath its skin, a labyrinth. Secret chambers, concealed cellars, spaces designed not for animals, but for people who were being turned into property. This was the holding pen, the staging ground where human lives were stripped of freedom and prepared for transport. But the farm was only one piece. Surrounding it was a network of taverns, roads, ferrymen, and wagons. Men who would whisper of work in Philadelphia, only to lead the hopeful southward, into chains. Drivers who would carry captives in false-bottomed wagons, hidden beneath hay or cargo. Boatmen who would ferry them silently along the Nanticoke River, where the water itself swallowed their cries. This was not chaos. This was design. And Patty was its architect. You must see her psychology clearly. She was not merely cruel. Cruelty alone cannot sustain an empire. Cruelty burns too hot, too fast. No, Patty was cold, calculating. She understood when to intimidate, when to charm, when to feign ignorance, when to strike without warning. That is why she endured. Think of her presence. 6 feet tall, towering over men. A voice described as deep, commanding, a stare that unsettled even the hardened. When she entered a room, she shifted the balance of power. Men who might not have feared other men feared her. And when intimidation was not enough, she used something more ancient. The manipulation of silence. Neighbors whispered. They always whisper. But whispering is not the same as speaking. And Patty knew the difference. She let them whisper. She let fear grow like rot beneath the floorboards. She allowed them to suspect, because suspicion without proof is paralysis. And when proof surfaced, she erased it with coin, with threats, with blood. This is how institutions of power survive. They do not need to convince everyone. They only need to keep enough people uncertain, silent, or complicit. And Patty mastered that principle. Now, imagine the victims. Free black men and women. Children, too. They lived in precarious freedom. Always forced to carry papers to prove what should never have needed proof. And those papers could be torn, burned, ignored. They had no voice in court, no protection under law, no shield against the predators who hunted them. They were vulnerable by design. Society created the opening. Patty exploited it. Do you see now how corruption works? It feeds on openings that already exist. Patty did not invent racial prejudice. She did not invent the hunger of the South for both. She simply stepped into the space created by law and society and filled it with chains. This is the second truth you must carry. Evil thrives not by breaking systems, but by using systems exactly as they are built. Patty's empire grew because the world around her was already corrupted. She was not an exception. She was a symptom. But here is what separates her from others. She was not content with profit. She was not content with chains. She killed rival traders who threatened her network. She killed captives who resisted too strongly or who might reveal too much. She killed children whose only crime was being unable to remain silent. Her farm became a graveyard. Each mound of earth another testament to her willingness to cross lines. Most would never even approach, and still society hesitated to stop her. Why? Because to stop her would require admitting the truth. That their silence had enabled her. That their institutions had shielded her. That they themselves were complicit. So they looked away, and she grew stronger. Now, I want you to confront something in yourself. What do you think you would have done, living near the Cannon farm? Would you have spoken out? Would you have risked your family, your safety, your life? Or would you have whispered in the dark and kept your door locked at night, telling yourself, it was not your responsibility? Most men convince themselves they would be brave, but history says otherwise. Most men stay silent. And that silence is the soil in which predators grow. This is why I speak to you in this way, not as a storyteller, but as a mentor dragging you down into the truth. Because if you cannot face what silence does, you will never recognize the pattern when it reappears around you, and it does reappear every day. In governments that write laws they never follow. In corporations that profit from suffering while pretending to serve. In institutions that demand obedience but never accountability. Patty Cannon is not a ghost from 1829. She is a mirror held up to your present. Her story is a warning, a blueprint, a test. She began as a widow. She became a matriarch. She turned silence into profit, law into weapon, and fear into empire. And every chain she clasped, every body she buried, every scream swallowed by the marsh was proof of one thing, that once power tastes blood, it never stops drinking. Do you feel the descent now? Do you feel the weight pressing heavier with each revelation? Good, because we are only halfway down. The bones were only the beginning. The farm was only the surface. The real horror lies beneath in the psychology of control, in the mechanisms of complicity, in the blueprint of silence that repeats itself across history. And I am going to take you there, one step at a time, because once you see it clearly, once you recognize the shape of this darkness, you cannot unsee it. And that is when transformation begins. But beware, transformation is dangerous, because when you know the truth, you can no longer hide behind ignorance. You must choose, and choice is the one thing society fears most. They said Patty Cannon's land was cursed, but the truth was darker than curses. Curses are whispers of fear, born in the minds of the living. Patty's soil was not haunted by superstition. It was fed by bodice. The ground itself was swollen with the silence of the people she had dragged into it. Every barn, every cellar, every outbuilding that squatted on her Maryland farm carried the residue of screams that had never escaped. You see, power leaves stains. Not the kind you can scrub with lye or water, but the kind that soaks into the air, into the wood grain of doors, into the straw scattered across dirt floors. When a man walked her land, even if he knew nothing of her crimes, he felt something, a pressure, a sickness at the edge of his breath. That was the weight of concealed evil pressing down, even on those who were blind to its source. Patty Cannon understood this better than most. She ruled not only with violence, but with an aura, a myth she carefully manufactured. She was a woman, in her 60s, heavy-set, weathered by years of drink and fury. But when she stepped into her room, men twice her size shrank. She didn't need youth or beauty. She had something more dangerous, the kind of certainty that only a predator possesses. Her network was a living machine, a marketplace of human misery hidden behind the mask of an ordinary farmhouse. The kidnappers would bring in their victims free. Black men, women, and children stolen off the roads of Delaware and Maryland. Sometimes whole families vanished overnight. They were dragged across the threshold of her property, beaten into silence, and locked into holding cells she kept beneath her barn. The air there was foul, damp, and unlit, but that was deliberate. Darkness erases identity. A man held too long, in pitch black, begins to forget the sound of his own voice. He becomes nothing more than a body easier to sell, easier to discard. But here is what most people never understood. Patty was not just moving flesh for profit. She was testing the limits of control. She wanted to see how long a person could survive without hope, how far she could push the spirit before it snapped. That was her real currency. Not just the gold and silver she collected from slave traders, but the knowledge of how to break a human being down to their most fragile state. Her men, the gang that surrounded her, followed her not simply out of greed, but because they were infected by her certainty. She made them believe they were untouchable, and for decades she was right. Local sheriffs looked away, judges found no evidence, and whispers dissolved into silence. After all, who would accuse a white woman of such horrors in 1829? Who would dare drag her name into court when half the county feared she would turn her knives on them next? But cracks always appear. Evil that grows too large begins to cast a shadow that even the blind cannot ignore. Farmers, traveling near her property, spoke of strange wailing in the night. A merchant claimed he saw shackled men being herded through the woods at dawn. Mothers warned their children not to stray near the Cannon land, telling them that a witch lived their story that disguised the truth, but kept little feet away from the path that might lead to a barn door that never opened again. By the late 1820s, fear was beginning to outweigh silence. The body count was too high. Too many families had vanished, and yet Patty thrived. She walked into taverns with her head high, daring anyone to speak against her. Her eyes dared them. Few ever met her gaze. Now imagine this, a woman in her 60s, known to carry a pistol in her apron and a knife tucked under her skirt, running. A crime empire so vast that even the men who traded in slaves called her ruthless. That was Patty Cannon. Not a whisper of evil, not a shadow, but a storm. A storm that was beginning, ever so slightly, to turn back toward her. And here is where the story deepens. Evil is not destroyed by exposure alone. It festers, it resists, and it takes others down with it. The first cracks in Patty's empire would not come because of morality. They would not come because of justice. They came because her machine had grown sloppy. When you deal in human lives as if they were cattle, You eventually misplace one too many. You make one mistake that echoes beyond your walls, and that mistake was coming. The silence that had protected her for years was beginning to tremble. The ground beneath her farm, soaked with all those buried bodies, was beginning to shift. And soon, even those who had looked away for decades would no longer be able to ignore the smell of what lay beneath Paddy Cannon's land. The beginning of the end never arrives with trumpets. It creeps in quietly, like rot beneath a floorboard, unnoticed until the wood suddenly gives way. For Paddy Cannon, that rot began with betrayal. You see, empires of terror do not fall because they grow weak. They fall because the loyalty that sustains them is poisoned by fear and hunger. Patty's gang, once bound to her by profit and intimidation, began to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Each man knew that if the law came knocking, Patty would gladly feed him to the gallows in exchange for her own survival. That knowledge changes everything. Trust dies, and with it, the silence that keeps monsters hidden. The stories say one of her men broke. Perhaps it was greed, perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was the crushing paranoia that comes from living too close to a predator for too long. Whatever his reason, a whisper escaped her circle. A name was spoken in the wrong ear, and suddenly, the silence that had cloaked her for decades began to crack. Officials came, not with the urgency of justice, but with the reluctance of men who had ignored too much for too long. They did not storm her farm in daylight. They crept, hesitant, half afraid of what they might uncover. And when they pried open her barn doors, when they dragged lanterns into the darkness beneath, the truth spilled out like rot split open by the blade. They found shackles, chains bolted into beams, holding pens fashioned from wood and iron, sized not for cattle, but for people. The air was thick, damp, and stinking of human despair. Bones lay scattered in the dirt, fragments of lives erased without record. What those men saw beneath her farm was not simply crime, it was industry, a machine, designed for capture, confinement, and erasure. And for a brief moment, even hardened sheriffs and officials hesitated, because what they uncovered was not just the evil of a single woman. It was the reflection of an entire society that had allowed her to thrive. But Paddy Cannon was not a woman to kneel. When they brought her in, shackled like the countless people, she had sold. She did not weep. She did not plead. She laughed. Imagine that. An old woman dragged into custody, her empire collapsing around her, and she met her captors with laughter. Not hysteria, not madness, but a cold, sharp laugh that told them she knew something they did not, because Patty understood the truth. The law was not her enemy. The law had been her accomplice for decades. Judges had ignored her. Sheriffs had dined with her. Politicians had taken her coin. Now they were forced, by pressure and circumstance, to act. But Patty knew their hands were stained with her crimes as well. If she went down, she would not go alone. The records say she was indicted on multiple counts of murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Bodies unearthed, testimonies gathered, whispers hardened into fact. Yet even then, the system hesitated. Even then, the machinery of justice dragged its feet. Because punishing Paddy meant exposing the rot that had enabled her. And so, locked in a cell, she waited. The bars that held her were not made of iron alone. They were made of fear. Fear that if she spoke too much, too many would fall with her. Fear that if her tongue was unleashed, names long considered respectable would be dragged into the mud. But Patty had no intention of waiting for justice. The story says she reached for a vial arsenic, smuggled into her cell. She drank it, and Just like that, she robbed the world of its verdict. No judge, no jury, no gallows, only poison and silence. She died as she had lived, in defiance of order, dragging the truth down with her into the grave. But do not mistake her death for an ending. Death was only the beginning of Paddy Cannon's legend. For what she left behind was not merely a farm. Soaked in blood, she left behind the blueprint of control, the proof of how far a single will, unchecked by conscience, could bend the world around it. And here is where the lesson sharpens. Evil, when exposed, does not always die. It mutates. The Cannon farm became a place of whispers, a ruin that people avoided, a story parents told their children to frighten them into obedience. But the deeper truth, the one almost no one dared to admit, was this: Paddy Cannon was not an aberration. She was a mirror, a reflection of the hunger for power and profit that lurked beneath the skin of an entire society. That is why her story persists, not because of the bodies she buried, but because of the truth she revealed, though most are still too afraid to speak it, that beneath the surface of law and order, beneath the facade of morality, there is a hunger that waits for someone bold enough, for monstrous enough to feed it. Paddy Cannon was that monster, and in her shadow the question still lingers. How many more like her were simply
Death
never
silences
caught? The body, but it does not silence the echo. When Paddy Cannon swallowed arsenic in her cell, many thought her story ended there in a stone room, a body twisted by poison, eyes that refused to close. They buried her quickly, not out of respect, but out of fear. For the living know that some graves do not hold their dead. The earth did not forget her. The towns around her farm carried her name in whispers, spoken only in low voices, as if saying it too loudly might summon her back. Children were warned, do not wander near the Cannon farm, do not stray too far into the woods. It became a place of silence, a scar carved into the land, proof the soil remembers blood. But the more the community tried to bury her memory, the deeper it spread. Stories grew. Some swore they saw her figure at dusk, watching from the windows of her abandoned house. Others claimed her laughter drifted across the fields at night, that low, cold laugh of a woman who never feared punishment. And then there were those who believed her spirit lingered, guarding the chains and shackles left behind, waiting for new victims to wander too close. What truly haunted people was not the ghost of Paddy Cannon. It was the fact that she had existed at all, that one woman, armed not with an army but with will and cruelty, had bent the world around her to her design. She had turned law into her shield, power into her servant, and the human body into currency. This was no myth. It was a truth they could not erase. And here is the cruelest part of her legacy. The systems she exploited did not die with her. They evolved. The trade she perfected, the trafficking of human lives, did not vanish. It shifted, changed its face, cloaked itself in new laws and new disguises. Paddy Cannon may have been buried, but the machinery of exploitation rolled on, faceless and endless. She was a chapter, not the book. That is why her story has been kept alive, not in monuments, not in history books, but in the shadows of memory. Every culture, every nation carries its cannons, those who know how to twist fear into power, how to profit from suffering while the world looks away. And when you study her, when you strip away the superstition, you realize something unsettling. Paddy Cannon was not extraordinary. She was inevitable, because wherever there is silence, predators emerge. Wherever law chooses to look away, someone steps forward to fill the void. That is the true terror of her life, not the crimes she committed, but the blueprint she left behind. Think of it this way. A house still stands on the land where she once ruled. People pass by it, some curious, others trembling. They say the foundation itself groans at night. They say her blood is in the wood, her laughter in the walls. But what they fear most is not her ghost. It is the reflection of themselves in her story. Because every society carries the same weakness that allowed her to thrive. The willingness to ignore evil when it profits the right people. So, Paddy Cannon's death was not justice. It was only interruption. Her shadow stretches far beyond the year of her passing. It seeps into the bones of history, into the way institutions still value power over morality, silence over truth. And perhaps that is why her story endures. Because deep down, we know the soil that birthed her still exists. The same hunger, the same silence, the same rot waits beneath our feet, waiting for another hand to dig it up. The graveyard does not close its doors. It only keeps them slightly open, just enough for one name to pass through. Paddy Cannon's name was written there, but so many more wait to follow. History likes to lie to you. It whispers that evil is contained, that monsters die in their cells, that graves mark endings. But you and I both know that is not how power works. Power leaves traces. Power leaves roots. And when it is nourished by silence, it grows again in new forms. Paddy Cannon is dead, but the pattern she lived by is not. It is a pattern you can find in every century, in every country, in every institution that values order more than truth, obedience more than justice. She was not a demon, she was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when society decides that convenience is worth more than conscience. Think carefully about her life. She built her empire not because she was stronger than others, but because others allowed her to be. Neighbors looked away. Officials accepted her bribes. Witnesses buried their words in fear. And slowly, what should have been impossible became unstoppable. This is the rule. Monsters are not born alone, they are grown in silence. And here is the part most people cannot face. When you look at Paddy Cannon, you are not studying a ghost. You are staring at the blueprint of every hidden predator who has ever thrived in plain sight. The priest who is protected by his church, the politician shielded by his office, the trafficker who walks freely because money blinds the law. Do you see the connection now? The grave may have swallowed her bones, but the design of her cruelty lives on, dressed in new clothes, hidden under new names. The soil beneath her farm is still heavy, heavy with the memory of screams, heavy with the bodies of those who never left, heavy with the silence of a world that chose not to hear. And that weight presses forward, across time, into your century. It presses on you, because the question is no longer, who was Paddy Cannon? The question is, who wears her shadow today? That is the lesson. That is why her story was buried, distorted, softened for textbooks. Because once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. You begin to recognize the same silence around you now. You begin to recognize the faces of power that smile while they destroy. And you realize what most men spend their lives trying to avoid. History is not a book you read. It is a mirror you cannot escape. Paddy Cannon's life was not a warning from the past, it was a promise for the future. A promise that as long as silence reigns, as long as people value comfort over confrontation, her kind will rise again. Not with chains in the attic, but with new tools, new disguises, new systems of control. And so I leave you with this truth. The woman who hunted and killed did not die in 1829. She multiplied. She scattered her design into the blood of history. And unless you learn to see her, unless you sharpen your sight against the darkness, you will walk in her shadow without ever knowing it. Patty Cannon is a name carved into the soil of Delaware, but the real horror is this: the earth is full of names just like hers, waiting for the right silence to bloom again.